Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer with Quilter Select, and this week we're going to take a look at how to figure out the math behind resizing a quilt block. So we've been working with a block that finishes up at 12 inches. But what if you came across this block or a picture of this block and you wanted to make this block as a 6-inch or an 8-inch or a different size finished? Well, let's take a look at how we would break down this block or really any other block in order to recreate it. Now, I'm first going to show you a very quick way using the Design and Quilt software, and then we'll go into the traditional breakdown using standard math to be able to create these blocks quickly and easily. So let's go ahead and get started. So here is the absolute easiest way to resize a block. So here is our Starry sampler block. It was built to be a 12-inch block. Changing the size is as simple as going into our properties box and adjusting it to, let's say, an 8-inch block and click apply. I can now use the ruler to measure out the sizes of the individual units within the block, or I could go to my print preview information and then go in and choose my piece analysis, my fabric summary, so that I would have all of the information that I need in order to stitch out the block now in an 8-inch size. I could do the same thing to create it at a 6-inch, a 4-inch, or go larger. Maybe I'd like to change it to a 20-inch block size, and it's just that simple. Now, for those of us who are not yet working with Design and Quilt software, let me show you another method for rescaling your blocks. When we have a block that we wish to resize, the first thing we want to do is really take a look at the block and study it just a little bit to determine what type of a grid the block is based on. So what do I mean by that? If we look at this particular block, you can see that it sort of breaks out into 4 units down and 1, 2, 3, 4 units across. So whatever size we want to adjust this block to, we will make our lives a lot easier if that number is easily divisible by 4. So for example, this is a 12-inch block, so we know that we have a 3-inch, a 3-inch, a 3-inch, a 3-inch. We could easily adjust this to an 8-inch block, 2, 4, 6, 8-inch, 2-inch units across our 16 patch. We could easily make this a 4-inch block, or the math would be easy for a 4-inch block. This area would finish at 1, at 1, at 1, at 1. If we were bound and determined to make this a 6-inch block, we're going to struggle a little bit because we would have to divide 6 by 4, and that would give us the finished size of each segment. So this would be 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. It would be easy in here. It would be a little bit more difficult in our flying geese or our half square triangle units. So make your life easy when you're wanting to adjust the size of the block and take the anatomy of the block into consideration. Now, if this were a vintage piece or something that we had come across, maybe a family heirloom, or we'd found it in an antique store, how would we map this out most easily? Well, I would start by maybe taking a piece of graph paper and sketching it out so that I would have something like a little scrap paper that I could use to make my new pattern or determine my new cutting information. So knowing that this is based on 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, if we wanted to make this block an 8-inch block, this area would finish at 2 inches, as with this, as with this, as with this. So the very simple math for this particular area, this is just a 2-inch block. So I need a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. So I would need to cut a unit that's 2.5 inches. This is the same shape. It also needs to be 2.5 inches. So does this one. So does this one. That also means that my squares in the center, they also are 2.5 inch squares. So if we went back to, in this case, our instructions where we were creating strip sets, we would cut our strips 2.5 inches instead of the measurement for the 12-inch finished block. Okay, so 2.5 and 2.5. Now what about the triangles? Well, we're in luck because you have several different cutting charts for your triangles in each of the lessons. But again, these need to finish at 2.5 inches. So if we were doing traditional half square triangles, I would cut a 3-inch square of my fabric D and a 3-inch of my background. I would place them right sides together, draw that diagonal line through the center, and then cut 1/4 inch away, then open it up and trim it down. But the key is I need a 2.5 inch half square rectangle. And it's just that simple to do the calculations. So what if we wanted to take it down to a 4-inch block? Well, in that case, this unit would be 1 inch finished. So I would add my 1/2 inch. So I would cut my corner solid units at 1.5 inches, because remember, it's finishing at 1 and I need to add a 1/2 inch of seam allowance. My centers would also be 1.5 inches because it's the 1 inch plus the 1/2. So I would have little tiny strip sets. And my half square triangle units here would need to also finish at 1.5. So we could go to the charts that are included in your 8 at a time, 4 at a time, and traditional 2 at a time half square triangle units that were part of this sampler series to see what size to cut my units or my pieces in order to end up with that 1.5 inch half square triangle unit. Let's take a look at this particular block and see how we could rescale it. It's a 12-inch block, and as we look at the anatomy, I can see that it's based on 3 units across and 3 units down. So I want to be kind to myself, not just for the math, but also when it comes time to do the construction. And whatever size I'm going to scale this to, I want it to be divisible by 3. So let's turn this into a 6-inch block. So 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches, plus the 1/2 inch for each segment. So my center is easy. It's going to be a 2.5 inch center, and I'm going to make myself a little note. Over here, I've drawn myself a mock 3 squares across and 3 squares down as my unit, and that center will be cut to, what did we say? It's a 6-inch, 2, 4, 6, so 2-inch square plus the 1/2 inch seam allowance. That will be a 2.5 inch unit. Up at the top, or in each of the corners, we have this area that would need to finish at 2.5 inches so that it fits into our block at 2 inches. We're going to further break this one down into a 4 patch. So for this section of our 4 patch to end at 2.5 inches or 2 inches, this unit will be 1 inch plus the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we would have 1.5 inches. This half square triangle would need to be 1.5 inches half square triangle, so that, or half square triangle unit, so that when it's stitched into this area of the block, it will finish at that 2 inches. So we would use our favorite half square triangle method to create our 1.5 inch to finish at 1 inch half square triangle unit. And then all 4 of the corner units are the same, so our math is done. And then this area of the block, this is an hourglass block or a 1/4 square triangle unit block. The easiest way, in my opinion, to do this type of a block, because again, remember it needs to finish at 2 inches, is I would use a 1/4 square triangle ruler, something like the 3-in-1 ruler. And then when I cut my units, or when I cut my fabric for this, knowing that this finishes at 2, I need each triangle, 1/4 square triangle unit would be half of that. So it would be 1 plus a seam allowance of a 1/4 inch plus a 1/4 inch, so 1.5. I would cut a 1.5 inch strip, of each of these 4 fabrics, and then I would use a 1/4 square triangle to cut them. If you don't have something like the 3-in-1 ruler at your disposal, then I would cut my fabrics just a little bit larger. Use the traditional 1/4 square triangle math to create this unit that also finishes at 2 inches. So resizing or rescaling a block that you already have is really just as simple as studying the block to see what type of a grid it's based on, adding your 1/4 inch or your 1/2 inch, because you need a 1/4 inch seam allowance for each side of the unit itself, and then using your favorite method to create the little units that are a part of each section of that block, and then joining each of those units together. So I hope this is something that will be helpful for you as you are resizing and rescaling your quilt blocks.